welcome to this webinar on the science of poetry. My name is John Gillies. I was a general practitioner for many years and worked in rural Scotland and in Africa, and I do some work as a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. The FRSE is Scotland's national academy, and its motto is knowledge made useful, and we hope that this series of webinars under the Curious programme will do precisely that. The fellowship includes people from a wide variety of disciplines: science, technology, the arts and humanities, social sciences, business and public service, and much of what we do is multi and interdisciplinary, and that's what this webinar is as well. So this event is on the poetry of science. Poetry appeals to the head and the heart, the intellect and the emotions, and it's the contention of our speaker today, Dr. Sam Illingworth, that science poems can communicate important scientific research that is being done daily across the world. So the format of the event is that Sam will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. And I really would encourage you to ask questions, because I think Sam's talk will be reasonably provocative, and it's a really interesting subject to debate.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to share my screen. So hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, John. And just point out, we've got a Q&A box. So if you've got any questions and answers, or any questions that you want me to answer at the end, just feel free to put them in, and then we'll come to them as we go. We've also kept the chat box open as well, so feel free to talk to each other throughout this session, and there'll be a bit of an interactive opportunity for you to get involved as well. There'll be lots of opportunities to ask questions at the end, but feel free to also connect with me via my email, my website, or my Twitter handle about anything that we speak about today. And I hope it is provocative, but in a good sense. So my background, very briefly, I'm an associate professor at Edinburgh Napier University. My work actually started out as an atmospheric physicist. That was what my PhD was in. But for the past decade or so, my research has really been around science communication, and in particular, using poetry as a way of communicating science. So we're just going to unpick what that might look like in the next 30 minutes or so. And I just want to start off really by thinking about science communication as existing on a spectrum. So, when we talk about science communication, a lot of people maybe associate it with dissemination. I've done some interesting science, so I want to try and communicate this science or this research to an audience, to a non-scientific audience. So that is what we think of as one-way dissemination. The scientist or the researcher or me communicating my research to others because I think it's interesting or that they'll find value. But then moving along from that as well, we can see that we can actually have two-way conversations. So working with communities, working with publics that are interested or may be affected by my research. And rather than just telling them about it, asking what their opinions are, asking what their experiences are. And just because somebody's not a scientist doesn't mean that they're not an expert. I always think about risk mitigation for flooding as an example of this. So if I was designing a flood risk mitigation strategy as a scientist, it would make sense to engage the community where that flood risk mitigation is going to be propagated, because people that have lived in that region for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years have a wealth of lived experience and tacit knowledge that can actually help me as a researcher to develop flood risk mitigation plans that are going to be more effective and more likely to be taken up by that community. So it's really important that we listen to the needs of different audiences, and that we potentially embark in this two-way dialogue, not just me saying, this is my science, be interested in it, but rather, what are your needs, what are your experiences, and how can I use that to help develop my scientific research and scientific discourse more generally. And then at the far end of the spectrum, we have participation, which is where we're actually encouraging non-scientists to become involved in the research. So through projects such as citizen science ideas, or through patient practitioner programs as well. And this is not to say that participation is better than dialogue, is better than dissemination, but rather that all of them are necessary for effective communication and effective science communication. And poetry actually provides a really powerful way of engaging different publics with science via either dissemination, dialogue, or participation. Now, you'll notice that I say the word publics quite specifically. This is because there's no such thing as the general public. No, the general public doesn't exist. There are many different publics and many different communities, and individuals belong to multiple publics, and the publics which individuals belong to change on a sometimes daily basis. And the way that they engage with science and other ideas also changes. So taking myself, for example, I'm a scientist, but I'm also a poet and a gamer and a father and a husband and a son and a brother and a Christian and a runner, and for my sins, a Leeds United fan as well. And depending on what hat I've got on at that time will mean that I engage with things in a different way. So when we're designing effective communication strategies and thinking about effectively communicating science, we need to remember that there is no general public. There's just multiple publics, and one public are non-scientists, but within the public of non-scientists, there's multiple publics as well. So this is just to say that there are multiple publics, and there are multiple ways across a spectrum of engaging these publics with science, from dissemination through to participation, and that poetry provides a really powerful way of doing that. So I'm just going to give you some examples of how I've done this in my research and how I continue to do it and how others have done it as well. So thinking about using poetry to communicate, so this one-way direction or this dissemination of information. So I have a weekly blog and podcast, both of which are called The Poetry of Science, which you can find on Google and in your podcast directory of choice. And each week I read a piece of scientific research and I write a poem about it. And the reason that I do this is that I want to raise awareness of the science to a new non-scientific audience, often because the research is important, but also because it's just interesting or bizarre or inspirational or terrifying. And unfortunately, scientific abstracts, which is the first way in which people would encounter scientific research, tend to be written in a language that is geared at a specialist audience. So what I do with my poems is I try to introduce the research to the audience in a new way. Now, I used to be very didactic with this and try to translate the scientific research exactly through the poems. So, quite torturous rhymes such as the ocean acidification in 1983 rose by a factor of 0.23. Not particularly nice. And so if you visit my early blogs, you'll see some not particularly aesthetically pleasing poetry. But what I realized was that actually writing poems provided an alternative lens through which to view the science. So it could actually be useful for the researchers and the scientists and the specialists, as well as the non-scientists. So what you'll find in my blog and my podcast is that I include a non-expert summary of the research, a link to the original research paper, and then a poem which attempts to rephrase or show the research in a new light. So I'm going to give you some examples of what this looks like. And again, I don't profess to be the world's greatest poet, and I'm certainly not going to be winning the Pulitzer Prize anytime soon. But what I try to do is to just reposition and reframe the research so that people can see it through a new lens and encounter it in a different way. So this poem is called Death in the Shipping Lanes, and this is based on a really amazing piece of research that looks at the whale shark. And the whale shark, which is the world's largest fish, it's incredibly large, obviously, but we don't know that much about it. And one of the reasons we don't is that we don't know entirely its migratory patterns. So what people did was they tracked a number of whale sharks using radio frequency tags, and they mapped their migratory patterns. And then they overlaid these migratory patterns on the world's shipping lanes. And what they found was that they intersect quite a lot. And what this means is that it's actually quite likely that a large number of deaths of whale sharks are actually caused by the whale sharks being hit by huge ships like super tankers. So this research talks about that and talks about the need maybe for certain areas not to be used for shipping lanes where we know that there's important migration for whale sharks and other species going on as well. So that's the research. The abstract, which you can see on the left, is actually very well constructed for a scientific abstract, but it's not written for a non-specialist audience. So people would see that and maybe not take away the main part of the research. So this is an alternative way through which to view that, the poem that I wrote. Greys and whites split the sea, mottled flecks of cream that simmer in the surf, hinting at the beasts that lurk beneath. Metallic vessels tower overhead, global fleets of freight and load that cut through filtered lanes with wanton ease, striking their unheeded prey with hidden blows of pride and gall and steel. A clumsy chant to stiff remains that fall to the floor without a sound. So that's one of the poems. I'm just going to give you a few examples of these and then move on to some other ways in which we can use poetry to communicate science. So another recent piece of research was, again, looking at whale migration patterns. I quite like whale migration patterns. And what this does is it's looked at the different ways in which migration patterns of blue whales has changed. And it does it in a really cool way. So basically, there's a series of hydrometers, a series of sound detectors under the water that are used by an organization to try to detect if people are testing nuclear bombs. Because if nuclear bombs are set off underwater or above water, they let off a certain frequency and people can detect it. But what people found, and this data is made publicly available, and what some researchers found was that actually, rather than using these hydroscopes for making measurements of nuclear weapons or potential nuclear weapons, they can use it to listen to the sounds of sea creatures, such as whales. And in Chagos, with the Chagos Islands, which is in the South Pacific, they basically found the sounds of whales, blue whales, that they'd not really heard before. And so they identified this new population of blue whales that they've called the Chagos blue whales. It's kind of a pygmy blue whale. So it's still a huge, ginormous blue whale, but just a much smaller one than the more traditional species. And in this new research, what they've found is that by using this data set of these hydroscopes that were designed to detect nuclear bombs, they've been able to map 20 years of these Chagos blue whales, and they've been able to determine how their migratory patterns have changed or not. And I just think it's a really beautiful example of using a piece of technology that was meant for something else, with quite negative connotations, for something quite positive instead. So that's the research. Again, feel free you can check it out from that link, or just go to my blog and I link to the original research as well. I try to pick research that's open access, which means that you can just get to it without having to pay for the research as well. And the poem that I wrote about this is called Changing Sounds of the Blues. Ears to the floor, we listen to the end. Instruments are tuned for every threatening quaver of our malicious sonata. Submerged in sound, a new song breaks between the silence. Gentle crescendos that flow with life across the waves, rising to the tides, above the hostile trill of our grand and ever near finale. Another poem. So part of the reason I love doing this podcast is that I read research that I'd never normally have come across. So I didn't envisage when I started the blog 8 years ago that I'd be reading the Journal of Dairy Science, but here I am. And this piece of research looks at the effect that wildfire smoke has on dairy cows. So wildfires are increasing in duration and frequency because of climate change and global warming. And dairy cows, especially in the Western United States, the number of wildfires is increasing. And also in the Western United States, there's a huge number of dairy cows. I think it accounts for about 25% of the nation's milk. And what this research has found is that actually wildfire smoke reduces the lactation of dairy cows for quite a significant period of time, for up to a week after the event. So what this tells us is that as well as wildfires being bad, it's going to have a significant impact on the cattle industry, because as well as affecting their lactation, which will then affect national and global milk markets, it also increases their risk of illness. So this is just an example of the knock-on effects of the climate catastrophe. And this poem is called Smoky Milk. Summer's drought erupts as thirsty soils and crowded scrubs ignite. Blistered winds tear across the sky, dusting each breath with heat and soot and blight. In hazy fields they wait, unwary monoliths of black and white, lying prone beneath our blazing, tainted sheet. Lactation lacerated by the febrile touch of our distant, tainted hands. And then the last one I'm going to read now is a poem about something called aphantasia. So aphantasia is a condition where people are unable to visually imagine something. So if you ask somebody to picture somebody's face or to picture a childhood memory, they can't physically picture it in their mind's eye. They can have word associations and things, but they can't picture it. And what this research does is, it was amazing, really. It got a group of people that they knew suffered from aphantasia and then they knew didn't. And it looked at their pupillary response to light. So they shone light in people's eyes, and the pupils, dilated when there was more light, and the opposite of dilation when there was less light when they were doing it. And it was the same for the normal group of people, or the control group, and the people who suffered from aphantasia. What they then did was they asked both groups of people to close their eyes, to open their eyes and to imagine light and dark. And the people who did not suffer from aphantasia, their eyes actually responded in a way imagining light or dark, whereas those that have no visual imagination were unable to do so. So this was maybe an early test for people, or a way of identifying that people have aphantasia, because sometimes people live with aphantasia without realizing what it is. So I just thought this was an amazing piece of research about a condition I was unaware of before I read the research and wrote this poem. Auroras of white skim forehead moons, quivers of light that push and pull at the edges of your optics, as shifting spheres dance with ease across a bounded stage of sight. Unreal shapes pass by, every curve and flex expressed in sounds that flutter out of reach, unflinching orbs of static black, waiting for cues that cannot be seen. So that's an example of how I've used poetry as a way to communicate, to disseminate science. But poetry is also a really powerful data tool to enable us to do scientific research. So these are two studies that I was involved with and that use poetry as data. So if I was doing qualitative research, which means research using words rather than numbers, a traditional approach might be for me to interview a number of people, or to have a focus group, or to conduct a survey, and then to look through the responses to those surveys, to those interview questions, to those focus groups, and to see if there was any emergent narratives that came through those responses. So I could ask people, what do you think about climate change? And then I could look at all of those responses and then see if there are any emergent narratives or threads that we could then use to tell us more about people's perceptions of climate change. But rather than asking people to write an interview, a new methodology I've been working on is asking people to write a poem. So asking people to write poetry about a particular topic, or identifying poetry that's already been written about a particular topic, and then reading those poems and see if there's any identifying or emergent narratives that can tell us something a bit more. So these two studies, one of which, the one on the left, looked at a number of poems written about climate change, and really just looked at how poets were talking about climate change and what that could tell us as scientists and as communicators to how to maybe better communicate the effects of the climate crisis with multiple audiences. So this involved reading a number of poems and looking for emergent narratives. And what that told us, actually, it sounds very obvious, is that there's a real need to reposition the human at the center of the climate crisis. It was us that has caused the climate crisis through our emission of fossil fuels and greenhouse gases. And it's humans, as well as wildlife and as well as nature, that are going to be affected in terms of climate change refugees, in terms of heat waves, in terms of heat stroke, etc. And really repositioning the center of the human is an effective way to start these conversations. The study on the right, which is what I conducted with my colleague Arianna Soldati, was looking at how human interactions with volcanoes have changed over the past 200 years. So we looked at a number of poems written about volcanoes and then saw how that had changed as we went. And what was really cool about this is we decided, just as I told you before, scientific abstracts can sometimes be not particularly engaging. We actually wrote and drew a visual abstract for this. So Arianna drew a picture of a volcano and I wrote this poem which summarizes the research findings. Not our God, but unaffected as we swarm like ants across your convex canopy, emerging from our shared landscape to create new identities that stretch beyond the rich and fertile soils that bask beneath your presence. Your destructive nature respected and then considered as we celebrate the otherness of your existence, naive in our assumptions that you would sense our feet beneath the shadows of your magnificence. So two examples there of how we can maybe start to use poetry as data, as a way to reconceptualize scientific discourse and maybe help to reframe some scientific research that's been taking place already. However, really thinking about moving along that spectrum of science communication, where I think poetry is really, really powerful is as a medium through which to give voice to audiences who have been traditionally marginalized or underserved by science and science communication. So what this means is that this particular area of research, it's about trying to develop this dialogue between scientists and non-scientists. But even though that dialogue is really important, it can be very difficult to do because of something that I call hierarchies of intellect. So this idea that even though you're an expert and you have lived experience and tacit knowledge and information, for example, about floods in your region, when you come to talk to scientists about this, you might feel as though, oh, I'm unable to tell them how I think because they've got 20 letters after their name and have a PhD and are really impressive. And so even if the scientists are very inclusive and non-patronizing, we can get these hierarchies established. So the work that I do is that we write poetry. So we bring together scientists and non-scientists and we write poetry together. And we use this as a starting point for dialogue. And it works for three reasons. One, it gives permission to the non-scientists to share their feelings and their work, because it's much harder to criticize a poem than it is to criticize someone's opinion. Two, it gives permission to the scientists to display an element of pathos or emotion that they're not normally allowed to display. You know, we're always told as scientists to be cold, hard facts, but I think that's rubbish. You know, we should conduct our scientific research very objectively, but when we come to talk about our research, it's okay to display emotion. It's okay to get excited if we've done something exciting, to get scared if we found something scary. You know, I'm a climate change researcher. I'm still affected by the climate crisis, and helping to break down that barrier between science and society so that it's just society really helps. And the third reason why it works is it creates a sense of shared vulnerability, which again brings us together. So once you've seen a learned professor stand up and read a dirty limerick or a badly constructed haiku, you realize that, oh, they're fallible and actually we're all in this together. So we write poetry together as a starting point for these dialogues. So these two research studies, one of which looked at people living with mental health needs and people who identified as refugees and asylum seekers, people who have a very, very low carbon footprint and who have a very negative impact themselves on the climate crisis, but whom are going to be extremely affected by it. And the other study looking at working with people living with disabilities and their carers, people in lower socioeconomic groupings and people from different religious communities. But rather than looking at the barriers for engagement, what are the opportunities? What are the overlaps? How can we work with these audiences and their knowledge and their understanding to help us better communicate the climate crisis? So for me, the research on the left, which is some of the poetry will stay with me forever that was written in these workshops. And as well as starting dialogues, they're really important for helping to remind us as scientists, the human, as I talked about before, the human aspect of these important issues and why we should never marginalize communities, but include as many people as possible. One of these sessions, the group of people wanted to find out a bit more about air pollution. And this was a group of people living in Manchester, inner city Manchester, just off Europe's largest bus route, incredibly polluted. And we talked about air pollution, and then we asked them to write some poems about it. And one of them wrote a poem that went like this. Poetry is also a really great way of problem solving, and we're going to go into a slight interactive activity now, if that's okay. So you'll know, whether you're scientists or not, that you'll be working on a problem sometimes in your personal or professional life, and you just can't seem to come up with a solution. So you stop, you leave it, you step away from your computer or your workbench or your lab bench or the field or whatever, and then an hour, a day, a week later, you're stepping into the shower, getting on the train, making dinner, and the solution comes to you. Now that is because you have, that's called the creativity incubation period. You know, your brain's just been working on this subconsciously, but it's a very, very passive way of targeting the creativity incubation period. So what I offer to you today is a tool, poetry. So the next time you have a problem, feel free to go for a walk, but instead stop and write a poem about it. And what that will do is it will force your brain to engage with it in a different way. And I'm not saying you're going to come up with the solution straight away, but what you will definitely come up with is a new way of looking at it, and maybe some additional learning experiences as well. So one of the best ways to do this in the most simple form is just to write a list poem about the problem. So we're going to practice writing some list poems. So what I'm going to do is, so get your writing instruments ready. You can write on your computer, or you can write on a pen and paper, you can write on a phone, whatever you want. We're going to write 3 poems. I'm going to give you about 40 seconds for each one. And when I say start, I just want you to write everything that comes into your head when you hear the prompt. So it can be things that you see, it can be things that you smell, things that you taste, things that you think, memories, ideas, anything you want. Just keep writing until I say stop. So we're going to do this 3 times. So the first prompt is list all of the things that are in your room. Start. So start listing them now. So I'll talk so it's not awkward over the top, but you can list all the things that you see, list all of the things that you hear, list all of the things that you smell. You can list all of the things that aren't there. You can be as literal or as metaphorical as you want. Just keep writing until I say stop. You've got about 20 seconds left. And we're just listing all of the things that are there in your room. And hopefully you're in a room that is interesting enough to have things to list for 40 seconds. Got about 5 seconds left. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. Okay, great. So we're going to repeat the exercise, but just with a different prompt. So you've got 40 seconds starting from now to list all of the things that are out of a window. And if you're in a room without a window, just imagine that there's a window. So all the things that you can see a cloud, I can see a sky, a tree, a chimney, a bird, a chimney stack, all the things that you can hear, all of the things that you can smell, all of the things that you can taste, all of the things that aren't there, just anything you want. You've got about 10 seconds left. Just keep listing them until I say stop. Got about 5 seconds left. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. Okay, great. So we're going to go into a last poem now. And you know, the last one, we can treat this as a very cathartic exercise, but I'll invite you to share it as well if you want to in the chat function. So feel free to copy and paste it into the chat function once you've written it. So you've got 40 seconds starting from now to list all of the things that you associate with the word science. So these can be positive things, they can be negative things, they can be people, they can be ideas, they can be formula, they can be equations, they can be theories, they can be anything you want. And just keep writing until I say stop. You've got about 15 seconds left. Okay, and 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. Okay, great. So feel free, if you want to, just for a bit of fun, to copy and paste that into the chat so that people can see the list poem that you've associated with the word science. And I offer this to you as a tool. The next time you have a problem, stop, get out your writing implements and write a poem about it and just see what happens. So I'll read out some of these poems as they come. Pat's just written difficult, which is very good. Kirsten's written view from nowhere, objectivity, detachment, progress, control, passion, understanding, knowledge, God trick. That's very good. Fiona has even formatted hers: discovery, ache, understanding, awe, I miss it, not for me, still my love, joy. Iona's written science, frontier, falsehoods, violence, beauty, wonder, magic, explained instruments, people together. We've got maths, hard professors, Jocelyn, space work, RSE, chemistry, school, failure. Jocelyn Balbrinell, I presume, who is also a poet and has collected poetry since being a young girl. She told me that on a BBC show I did with her once. Sari writes knowledge, narrow eye, expanding the universe, collapsing problems. Casper writes mathematics, atoms, 6.63 times 10 to the minus 34. Very good. Flag, interest, understanding, confusing, puzzles. Jim writes investigation, inquiry, calculations, theories, important, open. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, for engaging in that. So yeah, the next time you're stuck, write a poem. I'm just going to talk for about another 5 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions as well. So if anything's coming to you as I speak, feel free to drop it into the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, and we can pick those up. So poetry is also a really cool way of collaborating, and in particular of exploring the intersections between science and poetry. So these are two projects that I've been involved with, both of which with my long-term friend and collaborator, the amazing poet Dan Simpson. One of them is called A Change of Climate, which is a poetry collection available on Amazon. All proceeds to the Environmental Justice Foundation, which invited people from around the world to write poems about climate change. And we had, I think, 76 entries from 25 countries in 5 languages, and we picked 20 poems, and they provide a snapshot that helps to really localize this very esoteric, difficult concept of the climate crisis, and a foreword by the amazing British poet Helen Mort, and also one of the chairpeople of the IPCC, Valérie Masson-Delmotte. A project called Experimental Words, which you can find on my website, is a project that Dan and I have been involved with for a number of years now, where we bring together poets and scientists, and we ask them to write spoken word pieces that explore the liminal spaces between the two disciplines. And what this is, it's not asking poets to write poems about the scientists, researchers, but rather it's acknowledging the fact that scientists are creative, and creatives or poets are also researchers. So it's really important when we do these collaborations to try to bring together poets and scientists at the start of the collaboration, so that we can give permission to people to explore the various facets of themselves, rather than trying to pigeonhole them in saying, you're the scientist, do the science, you're the poet, do the poetry. And this has run for a number of iterations all across the world, actually, and they started out as stage shows. But in the last iteration, which was funded by the Arts Council UK or Arts Council England, we actually recorded an album. So we have an album that's available for free on Bandcamp and Spotify called Experimental Words, which features 10 spoken word tracks of collaborations between scientists and poets. And I would say this, but it's amazing. You can just find it on my website, or just Google Experimental Words Spotify and it will come up. I really recommend you checking it out. And this is a poem that came from the Change of Climate book. And I'm just sharing it because Emily Cotterell's a Welsh poet, and I think that it provides a alternative view of looking at the climate crisis, that actually there are opportunities, and that thinking about positivity is a powerful way to frame how we still have an opportunity to make a difference. I have loved coal like a teenage girl loves an older guitarist with a rough black smudge of eyeliner. I have built my life on it, screamed down decades for it. Coal, not dole, barred my whole soul for it. But old women gossip about the pit. I know the world has had enough of it. Coal with its head full of history, strong arms, filthy engines, heavy, the small town sex of it, broken bodies, white knuckle wives, the silence of canaries has risen from slag heaps and pit heads to thick air spluttering into anyone born late with withered old miner's lungs. I've loved coal, but recently when I sit in the fresh place built on the scar of my grandfather's pit, I have loved birdsong, green space, the safety and hope of it, wind turbines, rising white beacons, sharp-armed, slicing clean paths to a future. And then the final thing I want to talk about for just about a minute or so before I finish and take questions is using poetry to learn. So about 2 years ago, we set up a journal called Confronts, and it's the world's first peer-reviewed science and poetry and art journal. And I think it's really important that disciplines learn from each other. And poetry journals, I speak from bitter experience, can be amazing, but they can also be really exclusionary. And you kind of submit your work and then people say, yes, this is great, or no, we don't want to hear from you, and that's it. Whereas if we look at science, the peer review system where you submit your research, it goes to 2 independent reviewers, they give comments, it goes to an associate editor, they synthesize that and then engage in a dialogue with the author to try and improve their work. It's a really constructive process. So that's what we do with Consilience. People submit their poetry, it goes out to 2 independent reviewers and then an editor, and we engage in a conversation with the poet to improve and develop their work as a writer. You can check out our journal there via our various social media handles. And if you want to come and join us, please do. We are a team of 82 volunteers from 6 continents, 12 time zones, a mixture of scientists, poets, poet scientists, and just general human beings. And the final poem I just want to finish with is one of these, from Consilience by a very talented poet called Clint Wastling. And this is, so each of the poems has the poem and then the science that it inspired it. East gets less each year. The curse of stupidity, like Knut forbidding high tide. We protect vital assets and leave softer land south to its fate in the grey North Sea. East riding, it marks final landfall before the Greenwich meridian touches the North Pole. Longshore drifter roads Easington, Kilnsea, ground to sediment deposited at Spurn. Earth is scooped away by the Holderness ord, a worm of water uncoiling, twisting, making land sea again. Zero is imagined, a construct for longitude. In 100 years, nothing will lie east of here, and our house, 12 miles from the coast, will become literal. And Clint says that this work was inspired by the reality of coastal erosion of the East Riding of Yorkshire and how climate change has affected that. So, key messages from today's talk. Science communication exists as a spectrum from dissemination to dialogue to participation. Poetry can use all of these to engage audiences. It's an effective communicating science to an audience. It acts as a medium to give voice, and it helps to actively target the incubation period. For more information, feel free to check out my book, Science Communication Through Poetry, which will be available to purchase or in your library, published by Springer Nature. And also feel free to get in contact with me at any time. My email, s.illingworth@napier.ac.uk, my website, www.samillingworth.com, or my Twitter handle @samillingworth. So I will now stop sharing my screen and will very happily take any questions, which I believe John is going to chair. And thank you all for listening to me speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam, for a really fascinating talk on the relationship and the potential for interactions between poetry, science. I particularly liked your view on the publics, and I think it's a really important idea, because there are no monocultures, and particularly the importance of engaging with disadvantaged people who are often not given a voice in science or in policy or in politics sometimes. There's a whole issue there about Indigenous people and how they're affected by climate change there, which we may get to. But questions. So we have a few questions. So Fiona Robertson has asked, do you share the poems with the researchers you base your poems on? And if so, how do they react?
Oh, Fiona, that's such a nice question. I always do that. So whenever I write my poem, the first person I email as soon as it's released on a Friday is the researchers. And I try to email all of them and just say, here's the work. What do you think? And researchers are such nice people. They always get back to me and say, they're very complimentary, which is unnecessary, but they're like, oh, this is lovely, thank you so much. Occasionally they'll say, oh, like very occasionally, you maybe, there's a slight confusion in the lay summary, can you just change that? But people are really supportive, and it's actually led to lots of collaborations with different people as well. So I'm really grateful for the politeness of different people. And just a general note on that as well, I'm just going to type my email address into the chat so you can all copy it. But I'm always open to collaboration, and would love to hear from people about using poetry with science and working together. So to answer your question, Fiona, they're always lovely, and a lot of the times they want to collaborate as well, which is really nice.
Thanks very much, Sam, and thank you, Fiona, for the question. Just as a follow-up to that for myself, Sam, how do you assess the impact of your work? You covered a lot of areas, you know, poetry and participation, poetry data, poetry to give voice. You know, one of the things we try and do in science is to assess impact through some sort of evidence, I suppose. So how do you think it's best to do that? I know it's a kind of early concept that you're dealing with. But
oh no, it's a very important question. So I do it quantitatively and qualitatively. So for example, with my blog and my podcast, I look at how many people view it. My blog started out with 20 people looking at it a month. I now have in excess of 10, 12,000 people every month looking at my blog. So pretty good figures. Same with the podcast, but then that only tells you part of the story. I also capture qualitatively people's feedback and then people's testimonies. A lot of my research is qualitative anyway. So looking at how the work that I do has impacted their lives and how it's potentially led to future collaborations, and documenting all of that as well. I guess because my background is in science communication and evaluation, I'm quite good at capturing impact, but it is something that's very important, and I try to do it both qualitatively and quantitatively. So for example, looking at how to share my work either via, I've appeared on BBC Radio 4 and 3, my work's is going to be on BBC Radio 3 next week as well, being published in Times Higher Education, BuzzFeed, etc. Just making sure that people are aware of the work, and then also how they can become involved as well going forward.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a question which is actually in the chat box, but it's an important one. So I think Nicola has said, as a new English teacher, I'm interested in using this in schools to bring science and art subjects together and improve interdisciplinary learning and teaching. Have you done any work in schools?
Only with about 15,000 school children in total, Nicola. So quite a lot. Maybe not quite so much. Well, actually, maybe quite a lot like that. So the way in which I've worked with schools is twofold. One, a lot of times schools get in contact with me to use my poems, and for example, to read about the science and to write their own poems about it, and then for me to feed back to the students. So I'm always, if you are an English teacher, Nicola, drop me an email, we can work out ways of working together. Another way that's really nice is that we go and do a traditional scientific experiment, something quite fun like elephant's toothpaste, for people who know what that is. And then rather than writing it up in terms of introduction, methods, results, analysis, conclusion, we write up the experiment as a poem. And then it just gets people thinking about the fact that science and poetry aren't mutually exclusive entities, but rather complementary disciplines that help to provide us with all of the pieces rather than just some of the jigsaw. So there are two of the ways in which I do it.
Thank you very much. And from Patrick Corbett, it's been said that poets often write about weather when imagining climate change. Is this an issue? Should scientists correct them? How to give appropriate feedback?
Oh, Pat, that's such a great question. So if I speak with my atmospheric physicist, meteorologist hat on, I will be like, oh, well, that's not weather. And let's think about the difference between weather and climate change. But then if I take that hat off for a second and think about actually stopping people from having those conversations can be really exclusionary. So a lot of the workshops that I talked about, especially the ones around the climate crisis, people might want to talk about seemingly unrelated topics like air pollution, but it is all interconnected. And if you tell people, no, you can't write about that, or no, you can't talk about that, then it just acts to further exclude them, rather than saying, okay, write a poem about the weather, and then let's use that to have a conversation about what the difference between the weather and the climate is, and what we mean by long-term scales, and how my definition of long-term as a meteorologist might be very different to the definition of long-term as a paleontologist, would be very different to John's definition as a GP as a long-term condition, for example. So just thinking about using poetry as a way to explore those terms rather than to exclude is quite a powerful way of doing it.
Thank you. And this question is kind of related from Casper Ward. Do you think science can work in a poem if the poem's target audience won't or may not understand the terminology? It's there for its aesthetic quality. Do you think it can still spark interest in a scientific concept in this case?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is very much related to the question we just had. So I think if we're introducing a new scientific concept, like a new word or a new idea, having just one of those introduced is okay. That's not overload. The difficulty with jargon is actually where there's words that can have multiple interpretations or can be misinterpreted, such as, for example, risk. The way that I would interpret risk as a scientist versus the way that a non-scientist might interpret the word risk is very different. So actually poetry can provide a way to reframe and a new lens through which to look at words, but we can also use it to introduce new concepts as well. And as I said, with my blog and my podcast, I tend to now include this non-expert summary so that can kind of do the heavy lifting, and the poem can provide an alternative lens as well.
Thank you. I'm reminded of the continual confusion that President Trump had between weather and climate whenever he commented on it. So perhaps poetry might have helped him, who knows? Now, Kirsten Simmerville asked, do you find it easier to write poetry about living organisms than non-living things? What do you think about personification, anthropomorphism, as a way of relating to the non-human, non-living?
That's an excellent question, Kirsten. So I hadn't realized this myself until somebody pointed out when they read a lot of my poems, because when you're close to them, you don't always see it. But that I tend to use metaphor quite a lot in exactly that way to almost humanize the non-human, and to think about conceptualizing it in a way that maybe we feel more comfortable with. So even though I don't believe in, I try not to be a speciesist, that humans are at the top and that everything needs to be brought back to humans or anthropomorphism. I think that having touch points that people feel more comfortable with and that they can readily identify with through metaphor or through analogies are maybe a really effective way of starting people to engage on a topic. So yeah, I think that poetry can provide a very powerful way through which to do that.
Thank you. And Jim Walsh asks, do you see poetry as the bridge to connecting different disciplines in science? The cross-pollination of disciplines, he says, will become more vital in unearthing answers for us in society.
That's a great question, Jim. And I think, one of the problems that we all face as researchers is the siloing of information. And, how those of us who work at universities, it can be very difficult to get into a next building where people are actually doing something very different, but very, very related. You know, I think about the geosciences, people who are working on the atmosphere versus people who are working on the cryosphere versus people who are working on the biosphere. They don't always talk to each other. And that's not always their fault. It's because, you know, the way that scientific research is often set up, it's very blinkered. It's very, you focus on a lot of depth rather than breadth. Whereas you're absolutely right, Jim, poetry and other artistic medium as well present an opportunity through which to act as a conduit between these different disciplines, so that rather than just saying, okay, poetry is a great way of connecting the sciences and the arts, it's actually a really powerful medium through which to connect even multiple sciences to one another as well. So I would absolutely advocate for that approach, Jim, as I know you also do as well. So thank you for that good question.
Thank you. And it's worth saying that the Royal Society of Edinburgh, as I said at the beginning, is intrinsically multidisciplinary. It covers arts, humanities, science, social sciences. So it can provide an important vehicle for raising, I think, both in the scientific sense, but also for making knowledge useful to the public or the publics in this area. Fiona Robertson asks, she asks, do you end up finding yourself using the research as a metaphor for other things?
Yes, I'll answer very quickly, but I think, Fiona, as I said, one of my favorite things about doing this work, about doing the blog and the podcast in particular, is finding out so much more research than I would normally do. And a lot of it I feel a bit uncomfortable with because I'm not an expert in it, but it means that I have so many touching points when I'm able to talk about science and examples of science as well. So even for those of you who don't like poetry, I would encourage you to check out my blog and podcast just for a way of coming across new areas of research that you might not have thought of, but which may act as a tangential link, bridge, catalyst, or even metaphor to future research as well.
Thank you very much, Sam. That brings us to the end of this session. And I'd like to thank Megan and Kate from the RSE for facilitating and hosting us. I'd like to thank all of you for attending and for your really fascinating questions, and especially to Sam, academic, poet, game designer, journal editor, for sharing his thoughts and with us for the past hour. It's been a really fascinating hour and a lot of avenues there, which I'd be interested in following up myself, Sam. So all the best. Look forward to communicating with you in the future. And Sam's been very open and is very happy to speak to anyone who's been on the webinar today. Thank you all very much for your contributions. Bye just now.